2:47 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon. A senior executive sits at her desk, staring at 3 monitors displaying 47 browser tabs, 12 dashboard widgets, 8 Slack channels, all with unread messages, and a spreadsheet containing 87 KPIs from last quarter.
Her CEO asked a simple question: should we expand into the Southwest market?
She has more data than any executive in history could have dreamed of. Customer demographics, competitor analysis, market trends, predictive analytics, AI-generated forecasts, and real-time social sentiment scores.
6 hours later, she still does not have the answer,
Not because she doesn't have enough information.
but because she has too much.
This is the paradox of our data-driven age. The more information we have access to, the harder it becomes to make decisions. We're drowning in data while thirsting for insight. I'm Kevin Novak, CEO of 2040 Digital, professor at the University of Maryland, and author of the book, The Truth About Transformation, and the Ideas and Innovations weekly newsletter.
And I'm Elizabeth Stewart, Kevin's consulting partner at 2040 Digital. I've spent the last 15 years helping organizations transform operations and their resources, both human and finance, to manage change and address innovation.
Welcome to the Human Factor Podcast, the show that explores the intersection of humanity, technology, and transformation, and the psychology behind transformation success.
I'm so looking forward to diving into this topic with you today, Kevin. This is something we see with every single client, isn't it?
It's so true, Elizabeth, and it's getting worse, not better. Today, we're investigating why access to unlimited information can lead to decision paralysis, how data noise kills critical thinking, and what we can do to maintain human judgment in our hyper-quantified world. Here's a statistic that should concern every leader. According to research from the Institute for the Future, the average knowledge worker consumes 34 gigabytes of information daily, the equivalent of 100,000 words.
Wow! That's more information in a single day than someone in the 15th century would consume in a lifetime. But here's what's fascinating. And Kevin, you and I have seen this firsthand. Despite having exponentially more data than previous generations, we're not making better decisions. In many cases, we're making worse ones.
Agree. A recent study found that 70% of C-suite executives report feeling overwhelmed by data, and 62% admit they made poor decisions specifically because they've had too much information to process.
This isn't just about being busy or distracted. It's about a fundamental mismatch between how our brains evolved to process information and the information environment we've created.
For the past decade, through our work with organizations, each navigating digital and organizational transformation, we've observed something really interesting together, haven't we?
Yes, we have. The organizations that succeed aren't the ones with the most data. They're the ones that have learned to filter signal from the noise. Today, we're diving deep into why more data often leads to worse decisions and the psychology behind decision analysis. How data noise is systematically destroying our capacity for critical thinking. The cognitive traps that make us confuse activity with insight, and practical frameworks for maintaining human judgment when drowning in metrics or KPIs.
But first, let me share a story about what happens when data becomes the enemy of decision-making. You remember the marketing team we worked with 2 years ago.
Oh, the one with the 127 metrics?
Exactly.
Well, that was an eye-opener.
This mid-sized organization was struggling with what they called strategic clarity. The CMO showed me their marketing dashboard. It tracked 127 different metrics: daily active users, click-through rates, bounce rates, conversion rates, time on site, pages per session, social engagement, email open rates. The list simply went on. I said, wow, impressive system. Which metrics actually drive your business decisions?
And I remember, Kevin, the long pause that followed.
Right. She finally said, well, all of them are important. That's why we track them. So I tried a different approach. Your CEO asks if your marketing is working. What number do you give her?
Well, that was another long pause. And then the telling response,
And there
it
it was,
depends.
the trap. They had built an elaborate system for measuring everything, but they couldn't answer the most basic question: is marketing working?
Their team spent 10 hours each week generating reports. They had dashboards for their dashboards. They could tell you the engagement rate on Instagram posts on Tuesdays versus Thursdays. But when we asked them to identify the three metrics that actually predicted business success, they couldn't do it.
They weren't measuring what mattered. They were measuring what was measurable: activities versus outcomes. And those are two very different things.
The psychological cost was enormous. Decision paralysis. Every meeting became a debate about which data to trust. Every strategy discussion got lost in conflicting metrics. The team spent more time analyzing data than taking action.
As one team member confessed to me privately, we've replaced thinking with counting.
We call it the data noise crisis, and it's affecting organizations everywhere.
To understand why more data creates decision paralysis, we need to understand three psychological phenomena. You want to start with cognitive overload.
Sure. Research has indicated that the human brain can consciously process about 126 bits of information per second. Sounds like a lot, right? But here's the thing. Understanding one person speaking to you requires about 60 bits per second. This is why you can't truly listen to two people talking simultaneously. You literally don't have the cognitive bandwidth to do so.
Now consider the modern workplace. You're in a meeting while monitoring Slack, checking email, glancing at dashboard notifications, while trying to absorb a 60-slide PowerPoint presentation.
Your brain isn't processing more information, it's thrashing, rapidly switching between inputs without deeply processing any of them. Neuroscientist Daniel Levitin's research shows that this constant task switching depletes the very neural resources we need for critical thinking and for decision making.
Each switch costs us time, but more importantly, it costs us the cognitive depth required for sound judgment. It's a concept I try to ingrain with my students in every class that I teach. The result? We make surface level decisions based on whichever data point we saw last, not the data that actually matters.
The second phenomenon is what psychologist Barry Schwartz calls the paradox of choice, the counterintuitive finding that more options lead to worse decisions and lower satisfaction.
And his research showed that consumers facing too many choices experience decision paralysis. They can't choose at all. They have opportunity cost anxiety, worrying about the options they didn't select. Their expectations escalate unrealistically, and when they're dissatisfied, they blame themselves because they had so many options they didn't know what to do.
And this same psychology applies to data driven decision making. Kevin, remember that leadership team we work with? They spent 3 hours debating whether to use customer acquisition cost or customer lifetime value as their primary growth metric.
While their competitors were actually acquiring customers.
Exactly. The paradox. The freedom to analyze everything creates the inability to decide anything.
The third phenomenon is perhaps the most dangerous: confirmation bias in a data-rich environment. Here's the dangerous part. More data doesn't eliminate bias, it amplifies it.
Research from the University of Illinois found that when people have access to large amounts of data, they become more skilled at cherry-picking information that confirms their pre-existing beliefs and their biases.
I've written about this repeatedly in my newsletter. It works like this. A CEO believes their organization should expand into international markets. Instead of objectively evaluating whether this is the right move, they unconsciously search through available data until they find the metrics that support this belief.
They say, look at our brand awareness. In Europe, it's growing. Meanwhile, they overlook data showing poor international customer retention, higher support costs, and cultural misalignment.
And with the limited data, you're forced to grapple with whatever information you have. With unlimited data, you can curate data that supports a narrative for really any position that you want.
And this isn't really intentional deception. It's unconscious bias amplified by data abundance. The cognitive load of processing massive amounts of information makes us more likely, not less likely, to rely on mental shortcuts and our ingrained biases.
And when you combine cognitive overload, choice paralysis, and confirmation bias in a data-rich environment, you get organizations where analysis replaces action, measurement replaces thinking, reporting replaces strategy, and data collection replaces decision-making.
The tragic irony? Organizations invest millions in data infrastructure, believing it will make them more decisive, more strategic, more effective. Instead, they actually become slower, more risk averse, and less capable of the critical thinking that actually drives success.
Let me be clear about something. Data isn't the enemy. The problem is our relationship with data.
We call it data dependency. The belief that having more numbers makes us smarter, that measurement equals understanding, and that if something can't be quantified, it doesn't matter. This dependency is systematically destroying our capacity for critical thinking.
Let me explain how. First, destruction pattern. We've stopped asking why. In a recent workshop, I asked a room of 40 executives a very simple question. Why do you track the metrics you track?
And the most common response was shocking, because that's what the dashboard shows.
Think about how backward that was. They weren't tracking metrics because those metrics informed important decisions. They were tracking metrics because someone had already built a system to track them.
This is what happens when data collection does not have an essential purpose beyond gathering data. A critical thinking starts with questions. Why does this matter? What decision will this inform? What would change based on this information? But in data-rich environments, we skip these questions entirely.
I've seen organizations spending tens of thousands of dollars monthly on analytical platforms, measuring dozens of variables without anyone asking the fundamental question, why are we measuring this?
When pressed, teams often can't articulate how a specific metric connects to business outcomes. They just know it's important to track. This is measurement theater, creating the appearance of data-driven decision-making without the substance of actual insight.
The second destructive pattern, we've replaced analysis with reporting.
Take this example. A team generates a weekly report showing that customer satisfaction scores dropped 3% last week. The report gets circulated, everyone sees the number, meeting adjourned. But did anyone ask why satisfaction dropped? Did anyone investigate the underlying causes? Did anyone recommend actions to reverse the trend?
No, because the report itself became the deliverable. The data was presented, so the job was, in essence, done.
This is the difference between reporting and analysis. Reporting says sales decreased 12% in Q3. Analysis asks, why did sales decrease? What contributed to it? What patterns can we identify? And what actions should we take?
Reporting is passive, and analysis is very active. But analysis requires critical thinking, forming hypotheses, testing assumptions, evaluating evidence, drawing conclusions. It's all hard work.
Of course it is, Kevin. Reporting just requires running a query and exporting to PowerPoint. Much easier, right? As data becomes easier to generate, organizations increasingly substitute reporting for analysis. They confuse showing numbers with understanding them.
The result, mountains of reports that nobody acts on because nobody actually thinks about what the data means.
The third pattern, false precision, is one of my personal favorites. Kevin, remember the retail company tracking customer satisfaction to the 100th of a decimal point?
Their satisfaction score was 7.23, not 7.2, not 7, precisely 7.23. I asked the CEO, what would you do differently if this number was 7.19 versus 7.27? He looked at me blankly. I'm not sure.
This is false precision, the illusion that more decimal places equal more accuracy or more insight. But customer satisfaction isn't that precise. Human experience isn't that precise. The survey methodology alone itself has a margin of error larger than those decimal differences.
And false precision creates two problems. First, it makes us believe we have more certainty than we actually do. That 7.23 feels definitive, almost scientific, but very trustworthy. In reality, it might be meaningless noise.
Second, it distracts us from the real questions. So instead of asking are customers happy, we debate whether 7.23 is statistically different from 7.19. We're measuring with micrometer precision that should be understood with human judgment.
The fourth destructive pattern, we've lost contextual intelligence. Data shows what happened. Context explains why it matters.
Kevin, go ahead and talk about the SaaS company story. It's perfect here.
Right. They celebrated when their user engagement metric increased 45% in 1 month. Champagne was literally opened. 3 months later, revenue was down 30%.
What happened?
The engagement increase came from users desperately trying to figure out how to cancel their subscriptions after a poorly designed interface update. So higher engagement, lower satisfaction, net result, a complete disaster. The data showed engagement up. Context would have shown satisfaction collapsing. But collecting contextual information is very messy. It requires talking to customers, observing behavior, making judgments, synthesizing qualitative and quantitative information.
Much easier to just look at the dashboard and celebrate the green arrows going up. Critical thinking requires context. Data without context is just noise.
And when we stop asking why, replace analysis with reporting, create false precision, and ignore context, we haven't just lost critical thinking skills. We've created organizations where those skills are actively discouraged.
The person who asks uncomfortable questions about what data actually means becomes the problem. The person who points out that the metrics might be misleading becomes the bottleneck. The person who suggests we need less data and more judgment becomes the obstacle to data-driven decision-making.
And we've built systems that reward data collection and punish critical thinking. And we wonder why our decisions keep getting worse.
Before we talk about solutions, we need to understand why intelligent, capable leaders fall into these traps. Why is that?
It's because data dependency serves powerful psychological needs. Let's start with the illusion of control. Uncertainty creates anxiety. Data creates the feeling of control. When a CEO can look at a dashboard showing 50 metrics, they feel like they understand what's happening in the organization. The anxiety of uncertainty is temporarily relieved.
But this is often an illusion. Those metrics might be measuring the wrong things. They might be lagging indicators that tell you about the past, not predictors that help you shape the future. They might be precise measurements of irrelevant variables, but they feel like control, and that feeling is powerfully addictive.
Over the years, I've worked with executives who spent hours each day reviewing dashboards, tweaking reports, and analyzing trends, all while their organization struggled with strategic challenges that couldn't be solved with more data. When I suggested they needed less data and more judgment, the response was visceral anxiety. But then how will I know what is happening?
The data wasn't informing their decisions, it was managing their anxiety. The second psychological need is what I call defensibility over correctness. Here's an uncomfortable truth about organizational decision making. Being right is often less important than being defensible.
And if you make a decision based on judgment and it fails, you're blamed for poor judgment. If you make a decision based on data and it fails, you can point to the data. Look, the metrics supported this choice is what you get to say.
The data provides cover. It shifts responsibility from human judgment to algorithmic output. This creates perverse incentives. Leaders don't optimize for making the best decisions. They optimize for making the most defensible decisions.
And data, even flawed, incomplete, or misleading, feels more defensible than human judgment. This explains why so many bad decisions persist even when everyone senses that they're wrong. As long as the data supports it, the decision is defensible.
The third need is complexity signaling. There's a status element to data sophistication. The executive who says, we use a proprietary AI-driven predictive analytics model with 87 variables. That sounds more impressive than the executive who says, we talk to customers and use our judgment.
And complexity has become a signal of sophistication. Simplicity suggests you're not serious or rigorous. I've sat in meetings where leaders presented Byzantine dashboards, not because those dashboards inform decisions, but because complex data displays signaled that their analytical prowess.
This is what sociologist and economist Thorstein Veblen call conspicuous consumption, displaying complexity to signal status regardless of whether that complexity adds any value.
The fourth, and perhaps the deepest psychological driver, data lets us avoid the weight of responsibility. When you make a decision based on judgment, you own that decision, your experience, your intuition, your assessment of the situation.
But when you make a decision based on data, you can claim that you're just following what the numbers say. The algorithm recommended this. The data pointed in this direction. The metrics indicated this was the right choice. The decision becomes automated, impersonal. It doesn't become yours.
And this is psychologically comfortable. It's also very dangerous because most important decisions, the ones that truly matter, require human judgment. They require someone to synthesize incomplete information, make assessments under uncertainty, and take responsibility for choices that can't be reduced to simple metrics.
And data dependency allows us to avoid this responsibility. We outsource judgment to systems, then blame the systems when things go wrong. Understanding the psychological drivers is crucial because you can't solve data noise by just building better dashboards or cleaning up your metrics. You have to address the human needs that data dependency serves.
So, E, how do we navigate this? How do we use data without being paralyzed by it? How do we maintain critical thinking in a data-saturated environment?
Well, through our research and consulting work at 2040 Digital, we've developed what we call the Signal Clarity Framework, 5 principles for cutting through data noise and maintaining human judgment.
Principle 1, start with the decision, not the data. Most organizations work backwards. They collect data, then figure out what decisions that data might inform. This is exactly wrong.
Instead, the effective approach is to identify the decisions you need to make, then determine what information would help to make those decisions better. Before collecting any data, ask these 3 questions. What decisions are we trying to make? What will we need to know to make this decision well? What's the minimum information required to move forward?
Note that the last question, minimum information, not maximum information. Here's an example. A company is deciding whether to launch a new product line. Wrong approach, collect every available piece of market data, customer feedback, competitive analysis, and financial projection. 6 months later, they're still analyzing.
The right approach. Identify the 3 or 4 critical unknowns that would change your decision. Get clear answers to those specific questions. Decide. The discipline isn't collecting more data, it's identifying which data actually matters.
Principle 2, measure what matters, ignore what doesn't. This sounds obvious, but it's shockingly rare.
Most organizations have vanity metrics, numbers that look good but don't inform decisions, and they also have actionable metrics, numbers that directly connect to business outcomes. The ratio is usually about 80-20, 80 vanity and 20 actionable metrics.
And for every metric you track, ask 3 questions. Is this number changed significantly? Or if this number changed significantly, would we do something different? Question 2, can we directly influence this number through our actions? And question 3, does this number predict an outcome we care about? If you can't answer yes to at least 2 of these questions, stop tracking that metric.
I helped one of our clients, Kevin, reduce their track metrics from 67 to 11. They were initially terrified. 6 months later, they reported making faster, better decisions because they were not drowning in irrelevant data.
Principle 3, context over precision. Remember, all data exists within a context. Numbers without context are simply just numbers. Before trusting any data point, ask 5 context questions.
What's the source and methodology? What's the margin of error? What's the historical pattern? What else was happening at the same time? And just as important, what does qualitative information tell us?
Here's an example. Sales dropped 15% last quarter. Without context, panic. Emergency meetings, heads roll. But with context, the 15% drop happened because the company intentionally stopped discounting products, leading to fewer but more profitable sales. Net revenue actually increased.
The number was alarming. The context showed it was actually positive. Critical thinking means always seeking context before reacting to data.
Principle 4, cultivate informed intuition. Here's something data evangelists don't like to admit. Human intuition, when properly informed, often outperforms algorithmic decision making.
Nobel Prize winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman distinguished between expert intuition, pattern recognition developed through extensive experience, and magical thinking, gut feelings without legitimate basis. The goal isn't to eliminate intuition, it's to develop expert intuition that's informed by data but not enslaved to it.
The most effective leaders we've worked with don't choose between data and intuition. They develop the judgment to know when to trust each.
Principle 5, build decision velocity. Kevin, this is where Jeff Bezos' Type 1 and Type 2 framework becomes so valuable.
Exactly. Type 1 decisions are irreversible with major consequences. They require careful analysis. Type 2 decisions are reversible with manageable consequences. They require speed. Most decisions are Type 2, but organizations treat them like Type 1, demanding extensive data analysis before acting.
So for every decision, ask, if this decision is wrong, how hard is it to reverse? What's the cost of being wrong versus the cost of delay? What can we learn by moving forward that we can't learn by analyzing?
Let me show you how these principles work together. Remember that client struggling with the mobile app versus website decision E?
Oh, yes, 6 months of analysis paralysis.
Right. A traditional approach would have been customer surveys, competitive benchmarking, financial modeling, user testing, and market research, with still no decision. Using our signal clarity framework, we started with the decision. We need to decide where to invest our limited developmental resources. We then identified what matters. Will customers use this enough to justify the investment? We then added context. Customers use mobile for quick reference, desktop for deep engagement. Apply the information from an informed intuition perspective. Customers want better functionality more than a new platform. And then we apply the reversibility test. We can start lightweight and expand if justified.
Decision made in 3 weeks. They built a minimal mobile experience, measured actual usage, and made informed decisions about future investment based on real data, not projected data. Total time from decision to implementation, 2 months.
And more importantly, they didn't waste 6 months analyzing a decision they could learn more about by acting.
Now, let's get practical. Here are 4 specific actions you can take to cut through data noise.
Action 1. Conduct a metrics audit. List every metric your organization currently tracks. Apply the 3-question test. Eliminate any metric that doesn't pass. And be ruthless with this.
Action 2. Establish decision protocols. Create clear protocols for fast decisions, collaborative decisions, and major decisions. Most organizations have only one protocol. Analyze everything. And this creates paralysis.
Action 3. Practice information fasting. For 1 week, disable your primary dashboards. Make decisions based on customer conversations, team observations, and informed judgment. It's an exercise to break data dependency.
Action 4. Develop critical thinking rituals. Before any data-driven decision, ask, why are we assuming? What are we assuming? What might this data not show us? What would we need to believe for this conclusion to be wrong? Make these questions mandatory.
And here's what we want you to remember. Data is a tool, not a replacement for thinking. Metrics are aids to judgment, not substitutes for it.
And the organizations that thrive in our data-saturated world aren't the ones with the most sophisticated analytics. They're the ones that have maintained the human capacity for critical thinking, contextual judgment, and decisive action.
They understand that sometimes the most data-driven decision is to ignore the data and trust their informed judgment. They recognize that clarity comes from filtering signal from noise, not from collecting everything.
They know that the goal isn't to measure more, it's to understand better.
We've created unprecedented access to information, but information without wisdom really is just noise. The competitive advantage in the next decade won't belong to organizations with the most data. It will belong to organizations with the best judgment about what data matters and the courage to act on that judgment.
Next week, Kevin will be back for episode 5, The Psychology of Letting Go. Why we've always done it this way is killing organizations. What makes smart people cling to outdated methods even when they know or should know better?
We'll explore the deep psychological mechanisms that make unlearning one of the hardest human challenges. I'll share why your organization's greatest asset, its experience, might actually be its greatest liability, along with the human factors required to successfully release the past.
If this episode resonated with you, please subscribe to the Human Factor podcast. Leave a rating and share your comments. And if you're drowning in data and struggling to make clear decisions, share this episode with your team and your network.
For more resources on cutting through data noise and making better decisions, visit humanfactormethod.com. Again, humanfactormethod.com, all one word.
Until next week, remember, the goal isn't more data, it's better judgment. Measure accordingly. Thank you.